Excellent. Can I get the teams to go through their speaking order and preferred gender pronouns if they have them, or if they'd like to give them? Have we got Maurice?
Yeah. Hi.
Cool. Opening opposition.
Hi, Kevin speaking first here there, please.
And Jack second here, that's fine.
Cool. And CG?
Hey, Kira speaking first, no preference.
Hamza, no preference, please.
And then Theo?
Tin speaking first, here they please.
Mary speaking second, Shirley, please.
Excellent. So without any further ado, can I call upon Prime Minister to begin the case? Woo. Shemek?
Am I audible now?
Yeah.
Cool. Panel, I want to start with two very quick observations. The first one is that the current economic structure of the world means that a lot of countries that are authoritarian in nature, such as Russia, Saudi Arabia, or United Arab Emirates, are extremely empowered purely because of the distribution of natural resources. We think that this is unfair, and the good outcome out of this debate would be if basically after the drop in oil prices, they would be worse off because of many things that would happen for the people within these countries, because of the whole international structure, and so on and so forth. So this is what we are going to aim for. The second thing that I want to say is that this drop in oil prices is really important both in terms of the short-term consequences as well as in regards to the long-term consequences. When it comes to the short-term consequences, we are obviously going to talk about coronavirus crisis, and we think that it is crucial that the oil crisis actually helps us in keeping prices down, so that it serves as an amortization for the crisis that is necessarily going to follow. But secondary and very importantly, in the long term, we believe that this drop in prices probably means that we are going to push to a very, very great extent for look for alternative sources of energy, because panel note that it is not the price of oil that drives the whole economy being based on oil, but rather the stability of that, because obviously on either side of the whole economic link, so on both the supply side as well as the demand side, the profit has to be created. And if that profit is not being created in a stable way, we think that what is likely to happen is that companies such as BP, Shell, and generally the biggest companies operating in that field that know that one day oil prices are not going to be stable, are going to accelerate all of these technologies that they have, all of these patents that they have in terms of, like new renewable energy and so on and so forth. And these companies are very important in that debate as well, because these are the companies that actually have prepared for this sort of crisis to the greatest extent, which means that this sort of transition is very likely. So with that being said, some sort of characterization, two cases in my speech. First of all, why this empowers authoritarian oil countries, why it is a very good time for actually this drop in prices. Second of all, why this empowers authoritarian oil countries. The first one is very simple. So we want to know that specifically during this coronavirus crisis, when there are a lot of measures that would technically make all sorts of economic activity very hard, it is extremely crucial that we are actually able to keep trade going. We can keep trade going purely because shipping is extremely cheaper. Shipping is extremely important for the whole world economy, because as you might know, it is around 70 or 80% of the whole trade that actually goes through ships. And these ships obviously use oil as their fuel. It is only because that fuel is cheap that we can actually keep goods cheap as well. Why is that important? I think that this is obvious, but I want to point out two things. The first of these things is that it means better response to the coronavirus crisis, because countries can, import goods from other countries, such as hygiene masks, all of these sort of things. That obviously makes the whole responses process much quicker and more effective. Second of all, because that simply means that people are not that much fucked up, because prices are actually going down, which means that even if they're losing jobs, the whole crisis is not as bad for them as it might have been in another scenario. That's the first. The second case, why this empowers authoritarian oil countries. There are three reasons for that. The first one is that it punishes countries such as Saudi Arabia or Russia in terms of their symbolic power. Because note panel that a lot of their power comes from the assumption that oil prices will be stable and will never go down below a certain level. Second of all, that they can act together in that instance to solve a crisis, as it happened post-1973 oil crisis, or in 2014, or in many other instances. We think that it is very likely that we are going to see extremely huge hits to their economy, and people will start to question whether these countries are actually so powerful. The reasoning for that is that this is a very unique crisis, because first of all, it's extremely universal in nature, but second of all, it is coupled with a very huge differentiation in interest between Russia and Saudi Arabia that has actually started that war price. So the reasoning as to why these countries are not just going to, like talk to each other and say, okay, we are going to keep prices up and everything is going to go with business as usual, is because there is a number of elements that suggest it is not the same as, like back then. The first one is that lots of countries that were super reliant on oil in 1973, for instance, such as the US, are right now self-reliant and can go for an extended period of time without importing oil. So they can actually cut the export of oil from these countries, and these countries are going to suffer to a very great extent. Second of all, we can have a riskier strategy towards these countries if we are US or the European Union, because these countries at the moment we have, first of all, a smaller demand for oil because a lot of economic activity has stopped, so we don't need it that much. Second of all, because we basically have a better hand towards these countries, we can have a riskier strategy towards the Middle East, because we have over that years even more neo-colonized these countries. So basically, the most powerful countries that are importing a lot of oil have a very good leverage towards these countries. That means that in the end, it is going to be very symbolically bad for Russia and Saudi Arabia, and we want to posit that it is that symbolic power that these countries have based their power on. Second of all, note that oil serves as a basis of legitimacy in this sort of countries. So in Russia, it allows to run a huge patronage system for an extended period of time. It is oligarchs that are actually allowing Putin to exist where he exists. Once that oil is being cut, that obviously means that he cannot, give back all of these sort of privileges that he's giving back. And note panel that in none of these countries, actually people that are, being in this in these systems of patronage are believing that Putin is a good guy. They're actually questioning him every time. So it probably takes 2 months of an economic recession in Russia or 2 months of an economic recession in Saudi Arabia to have a huge part of establishment to question whether this country should look like as it looks like. Third of all, nobody's going to bail them out at this time, because there is no incentive for these countries to actually give money to this sort of economic oil powers if they are having economic problems as well. Why it is so important? First of all, and that is super crucial, it serves as an incentive to change the economic structure of Gulf countries, of Russia, to not be that much based on on oil production and so on and so forth. These countries are already preparing for the post-oil area. That means that we are going to accelerate that, and crucially, they are going to do that because this is the only one thing that can actually serve as a guarantee that they are going to stay in power. Second of all, these countries are more likely to change because it is the patronage structures that are allowing them to keep how they look like, and these patronage structures are very likely to go down. Thank you very much. Proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech. Now I'd like to cross the floor and hear from the Leader of the Opposition.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Splendid. Okay, 2 seconds. Just getting up the timer. There it is. Yeah. Okay, 3, 2, 1. The Prime Minister has fundamentally misunderstood and mischaracterized dictatorships, the international oil market, and the actual impact of this on these dictatorships. I'm going to make a really simple contention that might not be intuitive to everyone in this debate, but it's going to be real, a bit hardcore. A stable dictatorship is better than a dictatorship that is on fire. Right, okay. There's going to be several points in this speech that are going to be a bit wild. Right, first point, what is a dictatorship? How do dictatorships operate? Why are they so scared of their people? Shemek makes the fundamental mischaracterization when he says that he operates in this debating fairyland, where he says that dictators' power is predicated on symbols. Dictators' power is predicated on force, and dictatorship, the power of dictators and authoritarian governments, is also predicated on the capacity to pacify your citizens. Dictators always exist at a point of insecurity for reasons. Firstly, they're always afraid they're going to be assassinated. Secondly, they're always afraid of revolution. Thirdly, they're afraid of international actors invading. What does this mean? It means that the early part of any dictator's regime, they primarily focus on force and repression. This means that they use the military or invest a huge amount in the military to suppress their population, to control their population. As these dictatorships transition, this is what has been shown in the oil-based economies of the Gulf region, and until the collapse, which will be illustrative of this, Maduro and Venezuela and stuff, they use it to pacify their populations. Why do they do this? Because when you're repressing your population constantly, there is a perpetual information asymmetry. You don't know who your enemies are, you don't know if revolution will come, and you have no way of like building enough infrastructure, investing enough in other things to actually track your population or pacify them. The only way to actually prevent the perpetual threat of revolution is to make your citizens moderately happy. This is usually predicated on economic wealth, because people tend to value that more because it exists in proximity to them and can satisfy a larger number of material needs. Okay, so the specific mechanism there is that dictators rely on force, but get better over time. Like focus more on circulating like economic wealth and stuff to their people to pacify them. But crucially, what changes when this money goes down? What Shemek fails to acknowledge about these places, like the Middle East and such, is that their economy currently attempting to transition to a different country, but they're like a different like economic model, but they're functionally at the early stage of the United States in the early 1990s, 1910s or whatever the hell. They have an incredibly low workforce that has no real like education and stuff like this. This can be seen how they import a huge amount of low-skilled labor from places like India and China and literally enslave them by stealing their visas. 2, they're incredibly dependent on immigrants that could leave at any point. And 3, they often just don't have enough of a culture of education and other things to develop skills to build the high-tech labor and transition into that. Thirdly and fourthly, they exist in deserts. They aren't like going to be mass manufacturing centers like China and stuff that have things like iron that are easier to mine there. Oil is incredibly hard to access. Good, and they focus on that. What does that mean? This means that their economies right now are predicated on oil. I think Abu Dhabi, one of the Emirates of Dubai, has something like 30% of their economy predicated on oil. What does that mean when oil prices go down substantially or even minorly? In this case, it's been quite substantial, as Shemek illustrates from the coronavirus outbreak, right? So imagine that your entire capacity currently to control your population is predicated on giving them ridiculous sums of money. I think the dole in the UAE and Saudi Arabia for like Emiratis and stuff is literally something like $2,000 a week. It's insane. How it operates is you basically take the massive revenues from the oil prices, which your economy is dependent on, which is the only thing that you can supply like secure international loans and stuff against, because the only reason they trade with this dictatorship and stuff like that, or like give it loans, is because the long-term guarantee of oil is incredibly important. What does that mean? It means that you suddenly have a lot less money. What happens then? You just like, these countries don't have the capacity to borrow as much because they have poorer credit ratings, because they're generally considered relatively more unstable, and these countries can defect incredibly easy. That means it limits your economic policy. You probably go into recession, right? I mean, just think about it. If like 30% of the UK economy, or like 10% of it post-Brexit collapses, imagine 30% of most of these countries just literally like disappearing, right? Or like literally decreasing substantially, even by 2/3. Right? That's like a huge amount of tax revenue gone. That's a huge amount of investment gone. That's your capacity to pay for welfare gone. You're going to have to make substantial cuts. You're going to have to implement a huge amount of austerity. Why do dictators generally not do this? 3 reasons. Firstly, they're rational, right? They're, said before, scared of revolution. 2, they generally don't rely on technocratic expertise. They're someone that's climbed to the top of a regime, either through hereditary monarchy, either through revolution. They're not an economist, right? They generally do what is in the short-term interest, because their interests are always to survive in the short term. They're afraid of being overthrown or killed by a rival faction, even within their own group. This means they tend to pursue insane economic policies in response to this. And I think Venezuela, the obvious example is that they literally just start paying off their debts, which all of these countries also have a huge amount of to build the infrastructure that we're talking about here, and to simultaneously pacify their citizens and do that, is what they've basically done is they've involved in like massive printing of money to pay their citizens. They've like massively hyperinflated the currency. This has happened before in like a huge number of Latin American countries that were dependent on oil. This has happened like in so many regions in the Middle East. Like I think the only successful revolution that Shemek talked about was literally in Tunisia, and everywhere else in the Arab Spring was destroyed. So like basically what you've got, and this is going to be important for this next bit, when you've cut that, right? Who does the dictator pay? Who does the dictator pay when they've got a choice to make that trade-off? They pay the military, right? They make the trade-off and they revert back to the force and repression because A, their citizens are no longer getting what is necessary to pacify them. They probably rebel, they probably riot, they probably do what's happening in Venezuela right now because a lot of them might literally be starving, right? Secondly, you want to keep those people loyal. If the military has absolute power to topple your regime, you want to keep them happy. If they sense that you're a bad leader or you could be vulnerable, you want to pump a lot of money into them. Thirdly, you just don't want any dissent at this time because your position is incredibly unstable, right? You want to like, you've also probably built up enough infrastructure at this point to completely control the population, cameras, stuff like that, so on and so forth, tracking their movements. The UAE literally makes you do a medical test if you want to work there. If you're Westerner, tracks everything and taps your phone and stuff. Like, it's insane. They've one of the most advanced civil secret services in the world. It's actually really kind of cool. But basically what this means is that they have an absolute control over their citizens. Now they're threatened, now they're weak, now people are rebelling, now people might rebel. Even the threat of that is insane. Their own confirmation bias and paranoia makes them make decisions designed to protect their hereditary family, makes it designed to protect their government. Maybe they like semi-overthrow the legitimate government like Maduro. This just has a huge number of knock-on effects, kills lots of people, probably destabilizes these regions which tend to be quite close together. Ripple effect is this probably leads to like civil wars and things like that, which has happened again in several places, but I don't want to get into that. Pre-Iraq, Gulf War, prior to that, Saddam. And that's really bad for these regions and for the most vulnerable people. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech, and I'd like to cross the floor and hear from the Deputy Prime Minister. Thanks.
We're good? The opening opposition decided to replace engagement with a gross misrepresentation of what the reaction of any economy in the world looks like when it comes to oil dropping prices. Because if their conception of oil prices is dropping is true, then we would probably have a world war every 5 years, because that's literally how much it takes between different market oil drops. I think crucially what they fail to understand is that it is exactly because of models such as performative legitimacy that countries have the exact incentives to actually keep down their production of oil, to actually keep down the people from rebelling. And I think they recognize that too, which is what makes their case so weird. They genuinely say they want to avoid people going in and rebelling, right? And then they go on and they use 3 mechanisms which impact, and they have as an impact of those mechanisms, people will rebel. Like, this makes no sense, because exactly you have an incentive to have the best policy possible in order to actually minimize the likelihood of people rebelling. You have the most incentive possible to actually, exactly because of information asymmetry, not crack down on people, which would presumably cause even more of a rebellion, but you would probably like to do stuff that actually diversify your economy. These are all the middle steps that exist right before cracking down on people. And these are the steps which we've given you in opening government, and they've genuinely, like, except for geopolitics panel, like they've said nothing regarding our case, but our case was much more than that. I'm going to do 3 things in this speech. I'm just going to go a bit further through the different things they've said. But before that, I just want to make our case very clear. So maybe by doing that, I'll force them to engage. The first thing to note is that market cycles exist all the time. And as a result of this, the economy and its prices drop in order to actually create an equilibrium in the market. That's just basic economics. Even I know that, and I know nothing about economics. But the key thing to note is that it happens all the time, and we saw it in 2014 when China decided to invest a lot into oil, and by extension get a price dropping exactly because the supply was so far higher up. If it were true what they were saying, then literally you would have massive, big problems in China right after they made that investment, or in Russia, or in all those countries, and cracking down on the people to a unique extent, and having all those rebellions in 2014, in 1998, like these are the 2 I remember, maybe there are more. But look, the key thing is that this didn't happen, and what those countries did are actually diversifying. And I love it because they say, I don't know exactly, but Dubai's probably got like 30%. Well, yeah, that was true before 2014, when Dubai actually went on and diversified its economy massively, exactly because of oil prices dropping, which, if anything, proves our mechanism. But that wasn't even the mechanism. The mechanism is that, one, states will try and diversify exactly to avoid all those things and on the basis of performative legitimacy. But number two, it has massive implications regarding how companies react to it. And the key thing to note here is that companies have a double big problem right now, which is that on the one hand, they had prices dropping ever since the start of March, which existed as a result of the price war with Saudi Arabia. And it also has to do with Corona, which is currently going on. And if we want to be honest, we're not talking about the concept of oil dropping prices in general in the world throughout time, throughout the centuries, but we're talking about how they happen now. I think that's the best way to adjudicate this debate. Bearing that in mind, I think there are two things to note. The first is that the price war that existed already is something that would have probably existed on the other side of the house, etc., right? But the fact that there's also Corona on top of that actually creates massive incentives for companies to try and diversify. And I think they really failed to understand the nuance in Prashemik's point, which was that it's not just dropping oil prices which create the incentive for you to actually diversify. It is also that diversification doesn't happen all this time exactly because companies like Shell and BP have the patents to do everything that you want to do regarding renewable energy. And once you understand that, the whole pressure that is put into those companies are the ones that will kickstart this change towards renewable energy is the one that is so far better on our side of the house where well, no, it's not a policy, but you get what I mean. When prices drop, it's good that you put pressure. And when they drop to the extent that they've dropped already, that is even better because it forces even more the hand of those companies to actually give some benefit to their shareholders, who are crucially people who want money. And bearing in mind that Corona is going on, they probably don't have much of it. And being able to open those patents up and investing in those patents is probably the exact point at which you are going to have that diversification. And this is also true about the countries, not only because of what I said, but also because of the fact that these countries, exactly because of how afraid they are of oil dropping prices, they try to build up their programs from before, right? POI-OG, you're not OG, we are. Oh, well, no. So the thing here to note is the following, right? These countries are very prepared for this exactly because they know that if they get harmed to the significant extent that OO says, then they're literally fucked over, right? They're down. But the thing is that Dubai was being ready for ever since the start of 2000s in order to actually build up further those programs, right? So that they were prepared in days that happened. And that's exactly what happened. And that is exactly why Dubai was able to diversify so much. If you go and look up how Dubai has reacted to this, they've literally invested so much into renewable sources and so little on on oil. And the reason why is because they were not as they were significantly contingent on oil, but at the same time they weren't producers of it. But now, due to the circumstance I've explained the context, it means that they have to speed up the process and actually do the renewable stuff. I'll take a POI from closing if there's any. Yeah, Marie.
Look, oil has been boom and bust for, I don't know, about as many decades back as I can think about it. And Russia, Venezuela, Iran, Iraq, all of these countries have still not pivoted away from oil. Can you please give us actual analysis rather than, oh, but Dubai did it?
Oh, yeah, I can, which is the fact that right now the whole economy globally has shut down. And bearing in mind the fact that oil as a result of that is unpredictably in the future going to come up again. And bearing in mind that you also have a price war going on, then crucially, that means that you probably are going to have some difference. Or at the very least, final note, every single time a price drop happens in oil, it is a reality check to the fact that they're not going to stay like that forever, which is exactly what we support. We support oil price drops because if they happen all the time, eventually because they're boom and bust, people are going to start looking at this. Whereas if they stay stable for all the time, there's literally no incentive to change that. Also note, if the POI is true and they've been going boom and bust and nothing has changed regarding their position in oil, Panel, that also means that open opposition is out of the round, because ultimately we've also seen that exactly every time the boom and bust has been happening, Russia hasn't been going on cracking down the people. So that's a subtle knife, yet a very effective one in proving exactly what we've been saying about opening opposition. So crucially, we've told you why people are unlikely to rebel. We've told you why people are likely to focus on news sources. We've told you why geopolitics matter, but not to the extent that they say, and will not be impacted to the extent that they say. On those grounds, for the environment and for the people, OBG.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech. Now I'd like to cross the floor and hear from the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Thank you.
Hear me?
Not quite. You're cutting out a little.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. I want to note, first of all, that the sharp drop in prices that Kevin talks about is necessarily also required for opening government's case to work, because all of their analysis is contingent on the oil market becoming so volatile that companies will completely change their actions or states will completely restructure their economies. That kind of drop is necessarily very large. So when they say that this oil drop is just a routine part of like the existence of the economy, that equally attacks their own case. But even still, Kevin's case isn't actually contingent on a massive drop in oil prices. It's contingent on enough of a drop in oil prices that dictators and authoritarian states will react irrationally and repress their citizens. Firstly, responses to what they gave us on Kevin stuff, then responses to the OG case. Firstly, they say that these dictators have incentives to minimize rebellion. So if there is a drop in oil prices and they are threatened and they lose money and their economy falls into even a short-term shock, what they will do is continue to try and appease their citizens. That misses the fact that these are authoritarian regimes. They are literal dictators. Kevin tells you that dictators have two options to try and maintain control within their country, and even if they don't actually have to do that, they believe they have to do that because they consistently feel under threat. They can either offer rewards to their citizens to get them to cooperate by doing things like consistently pumping money into the economy, or repressing their citizens, increasing power of the military, cracking down on their civil liberties. At the point at which they do not have the money that is coming into them from the oil industry, and at the point at which most of their economies are based on this kind of thing, and crucially do not have any kind of infrastructure beyond that, because they rely on the short-term money that comes in from that market, at the point at which they lose that, the only option they have to keep themselves in power is using these repressive techniques, is hurting their citizens more, is creating more unrest within the country. So that is actually what happens, and not what they say about them performatively being woke and trying to seem nice to their citizens. That doesn't seem to be happening in Iraq the last time I checked. The second thing they say is that they have incentives to diversify their economy because they're worried this might happen in the future. This misses the fact that it's fundamentally what exists in these countries is basically a resource curse. And this is what Kevin tells you about. They don't have a long-term infrastructure. They don't have state investment. They don't have working social structures because fundamentally they don't really care about their citizens. Instead, they have short-term projects that they pump money into to appease citizens, like handing out food stamps, like pop-up hospitals that they build during a pandemic. They don't have a consistent infrastructure. What this means is it's incredibly difficult to diversify your economy in any kind of quick fashion, and in the time it would take them to do that, they would lose popularity with their citizens. Because of the rationality stuff Kevin tells you about, because of the threat they feel, their response is to do the kind of repressive things, not to do the kind of diversify stuff. Maybe this happened in Dubai. I don't think it happened in Venezuela. This debate isn't just about already developed dictatorships. It's also about the less developed dictatorships, like in Iraq, like in Iran, that also rely on this kind of money. What do we get out of the OG case? Firstly, we get stuff about how this is going to weather the corona crisis and help the West. Then we get some weird stuff about the restructuring of kind of stable dictatorships. On the stuff about companies being incentivized to create alternative forms of energy. Look, this is not how those companies are likely to respond to this, because this isn't how you respond to the prices in your industry going down. Firstly, that implies that in the countries in which these corporations operate, demand is going to go up. So there are legitimate economic schemes they can use to try and keep themselves in power. What they will do is restructure the operation of their corporations so that they are able to push demand and able to respond to larger numbers of consumers. This looks like what happened in the airline industry when Ryanair came in and fundamentally changed how people were engaging with airlines. airlines. You couldn't charge a large amount of money, so you changed the way that your planes work, you changed the amount of staff you hired, you changed the amount of things people had to pay for. Crucially, what that means is you don't waste money or capital in investing in other forms of energy, because you only have a finite amount of capital to do this kind of restructuring, and you can't afford to pay extra staff in that area when you are trying to pay more staff in the area that deals with pushing up demand. It also means you don't want there to be other competition within the market or other forms of energy that people could switch towards. You don't actually want alternative forms of energy to be cheaper, because if they do, then the one thing that you have on the other markets, because that oil is cheaper than them, goes out the window. Crucially, the types of people who will invest in alternative energy are the type of people who exist on our side of the house, which are governments that are trying to support their citizens at the point at which petrol goes up, at the point at which costs do go up in their countries. They have incentives to fund like non-profitable industries in the short term, because in the long term they want to help their citizens. That incentive structure does not exist for these companies, which short term need to survive the price shock that they are dealing with at the point at which OG happens and need to stay afloat. But even on a point of weighing, even if all of that is true, I think we are happy enough for there to not be alternative renewable energy at the point at which it stops people dying and being repressed and starving in dictatorial regimes. Because the degree to which the energy industry is actually going to be able to stop climate change by shifting into renewable energy within the near future is actually rather small and realistically marginal, because the amount of time it will take to do it and the amount of changes they will have to make are so large that it is unlikely this is going to come out at the point at which there will still be oil companies. People will still culturally subscribe to buying petrol. People will still do things like that. The second thing they say is that oil being cheap will be helpful during the crisis. Firstly, it is completely possible for governments to subsidize the price of oil. We are seeing already in the coronavirus the willingness of governments to push money into their economies to try and weather this, to respond to it in a different way to 2008. We think that's completely possible. Secondly, oil prices are not going to go so ridiculously high that it will completely cripple economies and completely affect recessions. So it's actually quite a marginal point. But thirdly, note that specifically what would happen on their side of the house is because of this restructuring that happens within companies, and because of the fact that companies are losing money initially because people are paying less for oil, what they will do is they will fire their workers, they will cut back on their plants, they will reduce the scale of their operations. What that means is more people are going to become unemployed during this crisis, more people are going to have less access to jobs, more people are going to have less access to capital. Before I move on to the restructuring stuff, I'll take a POI from closing.
Yeah. State repression can only work against small pockets, such as dissidents. When the entire country is unhappy with you because of declining revenues, you will have a civil war if you repress them.
Yes, and we think that is also bad, and that is what happens at the point at which irrational dictators engage in this kind of policymaking. I would note also at this point that because it will be an exogenous shock that is causing this to their country, there is no successor for the dictator if the dictator falls in this way. There are no other countries with a vested interest in trying to establish a regime in the country. So what happens is you create things like long-term civil wars and power vacuums that happen at the point at which these regimes fall. What do they tell us about the patronage structure in certain types of countries? This makes no sense at all, because fundamentally the patronage structure may have been what got these individuals into power. It is not what maintains them in power currently. That is things like repression, that is things like Putin's cult of personality, that is things like all of the crackdowns of civil liberties that he's had already. Even if the oligarchs pull out their support, he can just get support from the other oligarchs that aren't in the oil industry. I'd note that is a competitive group of individuals and segment of the economy anyway, but also we can rely on all of his other mechanisms to continue to exist. That point still doesn't stand in the debate. Crucially, Kevin and I show you that if this happens in the extent to which OG care about it, or even to slightly less than that, it will crucially destroy an incredibly vulnerable group of people in economies that do not have the ability to weather that shock, do not have the ability to respond to that well. That's the most important thing in this debate. Proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech, and now I'd like to cross the floor and hear from the government member speaker. Thank you.
Hey, can you hear me? Yeah, cool. The oil industry is probably the most unequal in the world. It's exploitative, it's wrecking the planet, it starves people of human capital because they're rendered dependent on national resources. Opening government give reasons why high oil prices are problematic, but I think don't specify why the counterfactual is necessarily likely to be one that is significantly more equitable and how these incentives change. Therefore, we're going to extend an OG in a couple of ways. First of all, instead of just saying it happened in Dubai, therefore it happened, we're going to give mechanisms about how this comes about, specifically focusing on investors, given that we think the shift doesn't just happen in countries, but has to come from the MNCs who invest in this kind of technology and production in the first place, and that's critical. And then second, we're going to be a lot more specific about why this leads to a much more equitable comparative, such that the trajectory is much better in the countries which all of us in this debate care about. First of all, just a few extraneous things to note on opening opposition's argument about like stable democracies being better. I think their argument is like keeping people happy is better than them being forced to be oppressed. But first of all, I just want to push back on the intuition that people in countries which are dependent on natural resources all enjoy the benefits of these natural resources. Like, these are countries which are incredibly exploitative industries where people work in terrible conditions. Inequality is massive because the gap between the CEOs and the people who are extracting the oil are exponential. Like, you can't just assert that because the country has money at the top because of systems of patronage, therefore that trickles down to everyone. So I think if we're caring about their welfare, it's not enough to just assert that. But I think secondly, and this clashes what we just heard from the deputy leader of the opposition speech, which is that the reason these governments maintain power is because the way to get legitimacy and popular support is to have partnerships with oil companies, because that's how you get that's how you get popular support, or that's how you prove your legitimacy, because the oil companies literally control everything. At the point where the oil economy becomes less significant because the industry shifts, you therefore have to earn your legitimacy in other ways, which is exactly what opening opposition want, which is keeping people happy by giving them money and giving them livelihoods, investing in their capital development, because you can't just be buddies with the oil industry in order to like keep the country running and say that's enough. I think this is important, and this is the bit the opening government missed, because if you can't depend on natural resources to generate your economy, I mean, first of all, dictators still have a self-preservation interest, so they still obviously want to keep the economy up, because that's how you like maintain legitimacy and maintain control. But if you can't rely on natural resources, you have to invest in human capital, which means upskilling, which means investing in training and education and social services, so that people can be the resource which makes your economy great, rather than relying on oil. I think that's a much more realistic comparative, and that's how you're going to fulfill the self-preservation instinct. But let's move on. So I think opening government are right when they say, you know, lower oil prices leads to less oil production because the industry definitely goes down. I think what's important here is that oil companies have to sell oil at really low prices and sell for less. The alternative to this is what companies sometimes try and do, where you like take oil and then hold it to then resell it when the prices are higher. I think it's important that we deal with this, otherwise it's not always true that they just lose money through this oil. But I think the reason that you can't happen is because like national legislation bans against it. This is increasingly happening. Specifically now we're seeing calls for international legislation doing this. I think another reason is that stockpiling of oil is incredibly expensive. Creating tankards and refineries are a structural barrier to being able to keep oil as a valuable resource for when it becomes valuable again, which means that companies necessarily have to lose money when they invest in this. The thing is that rich people and investors move where the money goes. I think this is analogous to like the transformation we've seen in the tobacco industry moving towards e-cigarettes, because they recognize that's where the market shifts, so you follow the money, adapt to changes. I think opening government gave you the logic of you follow the money, but I don't think they explain why this definitely happens for companies and investors in this specific case. A couple of things I want to add here. First of all, realistically, this is a steady, slow decline toward transitioning industries, because you need time to adapt, you need time to set up new infrastructure, you need time to make sure that it's a smooth transition. This gives governments time to like regulate and go along with it in a way which is going to be slow and steady, predictable, and not cause the massive shocks, which I presume are like assertion in opposition, in order to make this happen, because that's economically feasible. Because if you're transitioning into a new industry, you want to make sure that you do it, you establish a dominant position in the market, which doesn't happen if it's a shock that you can't plan for. But secondly, and most importantly, I think this is realistically going to happen into renewable energy, into green forms of renewable energy. Opening governments say oil dominates because of its stability, therefore we'll switch to renewables because energy is like stable. I don't think this like proves why they can't just go into another stable market. Like, they could just make iPhones or TVs, I don't know, they could just invest in something else. The reason they're going to go into renewables and develop in green industry such that it develops is for lots of reasons, because it makes sense to invest in the energy market when you know about the energy market. Because being successful in the oil industry isn't just about knowing about physical extraction and how to run like extracting oil and specific like scientific processes. It's about how to bargain with the people that you're bargaining with, how to negotiate what different stakeholders want in the oil industry, how to interact with them, what different countries want, how invested they are, or like how much they're willing to pay for certain kinds of energy, how dependent they are. are, how you interact with stakeholders, how dynamics in the energy market work, which means that if the oil companies move into renewable technology and green energy, they have a massive advantage because they understand the energy industry already. So that's a massive incentive to be able to shift all that money towards developing green resources. I think it's wrong for opening opposition to be like, we can outweigh this. I literally think climate change cannot be over impacted in this debate, given every single citizen will die in a fire of eternal torture if the world burns up. Energy companies are massively responsible for this. If we can save all that people from all that suffering by reducing climate change, by shifting towards like energy markets before the oil runs out and we're in catastrophe already, that is massively valuable. But what is the second point of comparative that we think happens? Because I think currently, the oil economy is one of the most unequal global value chains in the world. Like if you look at the differentials between CEOs and people who work in like extracting crude oil. The reason for this is that governments know companies will pay them a lot of money in the short term. So governments sell out oil fields for the short term, which means you don't get government regulation because they want to be pally with the oil companies, specifically because of the massive dependency problem we've talked about. So you can't get regulation, you can't get any kind of equity, particularly given the geographic concentration of like oil companies in certain regions means they monopolize that and can have incredibly exploitative practices which no one can call out because they're dependent on them for all of the economy. I think the counterfactual is more equitable industries being invested in for a couple of reasons. One, because national economies can only survive through human resource development, upskilling, education, vocational skill work, mobilizing the poor. These are things which necessarily come with increased inequality because you have to mobilize your workers to do something valuable, which means empowering them to be part of the economy. Second of all, you get more competition when your industry is not as geographically concentrated as natural resource industry is, which gives specific monopolies to specific companies. I think this is important given one of the symptoms of the resource curse, which hasn't been mentioned yet, is the mass public complacency towards public services. Because there's no, like I said, there's no incentive to invest in education or infrastructure because you just rely on resources. This is how you get equity, by looking at social service provision as the best counterfactual to advance your economy beyond natural resources. This is specifically important in the context of the conflict which comes about because of oil, because internal conflict in the country is massively important in creating political instability through which you can never develop social services because there's always a battle over who controls that one area where all the oil is, rather than who can keep the population as a whole well and able to work and contribute. For all these reasons, I'm very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech.
Do you mind waiting do you mind waiting literally 10 seconds while I run to the toilet? I'm really sorry.
Cool. I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech. I'm just going to have a brief interlude. Marie.
All right, let's go.
Cool. And with that, can I please call upon the opposition member speaker to continue the debate? Thanks.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Okay. 3, 2, 1. I think opening half is very one-dimensional to talk only about dictatorships. I think CG is a little bit more to the point, but still quite dependent on OG's mechanisms. We're going to take the debate a bit more global, talk about how this is going to cause a global recession in the economy, also talk about climate change. But let's proceed with opening half and CG. A lot of extension material is going to happen there. First of all, on the dictatorship's logic, we would like opening government to note that a lot of countries and people outside the scope of the countries you don't like are also going to be hit by this, including rich countries. An example of this, the United States of America, who's had a huge economic windfall due to shale fracking in their country, which means a number of states like Iowa and a huge number of cities have become dependent on the oil business and the huge amount of jobs this business provides. At the point where it goes out of business, this is likely to cause recession, not just in these states, but in the entire economy, because it's perceived as a domino effect over many states, which have been pouring a lot of GDP into the United States of America. It causes things such as inflation, such as bank rush when the recession starts, people pulling money out of banks, these banks being unable to issue people back their money, to issue loans and stuff like this. This has huge economic impacts outside the scope of the countries you want to destroy. This already outframes OG. But let's talk about diversification of countries and also of companies. This is where CG comes in. On countries, Not what is happening in OPEC currently is absolutely opposite to what the government is claiming. Saudi is not trying to diversify. Saudi is literally overproducing, being willing to sacrifice their own economy and the livelihoods of their own people, contrary to what CG says, to fuck up other countries to destroying the prices of oil, which proves, exactly as open government themselves concede, that the richest countries, that those you want to change, which are the primary producers of oil, are very well set to survive these crises and absolutely willing to use this resource they have in the expectation that it's going to rise in the future. However, the country this fucks up are countries like Algeria, for example, who do not have a diversified economy and cannot invest in human resources. Is their only fucking comparative advantage to provide for their people. But further on diversification, we said when oil is cheap, this means people are switching to oil and producing with oil more, which means that the demand for oil still exists, although the prices are lower. So to the extent to which like R&D and technology for renewable sources is already expensive, and there is already a crisis, as both governments concede, companies are more likely to be risk averse and utilize that demand rather than shift. But secondly, as Mira tells you in a POI, oil has historically been boom and bust. The response from government is, but the crisis now changes this. There were wars in oil-producing countries. There was a recession in 2008, yet Saudi has had the same dynasty for decades, which has not gone questioned, right? Companies analyze historical patterns as well. When they know that oil prices have risen after every crisis after they have fallen, they're likely to expect that in the future. They also know that what they have in their possession is an extremely rare resource, which means they can utilize that to utilize periods of higher prices in the future because they get to manipulate demand because they have control over the supply. They also have things such as huge contingency funds, right? Which they already use to pay the horrible fines that they incur when they, I don't know, spill stuff in the Mexican Gulf and stuff like this. So even though the European Union, like the millennials, the general public still lobbying against those regulations and not trying to diversify, right? Because of the market expectations that they have, because they have seen worse crises than this, and yet expected that oil is going to rise again. So know that CG at this point is also premised on the fact that diversification is going to happen. To the point that I show you that A, the countries in OPEC are unwilling to diversify and rather to overproduce oil. B, that companies do not have these incentives, and also see that this fucks up people globally. It probably takes out both governments. But the key frame of this debate is not what is going to happen in dictatorships and stuff. It's what's going to happen to the global economy. Note that it's not just Corona causing the current global crisis. It's stuff like the trade war between the United States and China. It's stuff like the interest rates in the Fed and stuff like this. Unpredictable governments like Trump and Xi Jinping and stuff like this. What does this mean? This means that when you take into account that oil is used as an indicator for predictions on the global economy, this means that market risk assessment is largely predicated on the prices of oil and how these prices have an outlook in the next 2 or 3 years, which means that dropping prices of oil are likely to mean stagnation, passivity in terms of investment, less FDI, and economic contraction in all sectors. For example, numerous researchers have shown there's a huge correlation between oil prices going down and tech stocks being sold off, which means that the prices of stocks in the tech sector and the IT sector, which are very important for development in some countries and a large source of their GDP, also go down. This means that as a consequence, when you have oil prices going down, you have globally a fucking bunch of layoffs, you have less FDI, you have companies predicting that people are going to spend less because they predict that oil prices are going to lead to a recession, which means you get slashes in production, which means you do not get greenfield and brownfield investments, which means you do not get new job spaces open. This cuts across all sectors and is therefore also more likely to hurt those countries which are dependent on a specific sector, which does not have to be the oil sector, but specifically are undiversified. Whereas on the comparative, stable oil prices in a crisis are an indication of a safer investment climate, are an indication which leads market assessors to believe that the crisis is going to go very soon, or at least not impact the economy significantly, which means that there is more money running within the economy. When that doesn't happen, what you're more likely to get is also countries reacting to take very bad debts and debt conditions to service the crisis that they perceive is going to happen. And then again, this also hurts a lot of the countries the government talks about. This is how you get Venezuela, right? When they perceived the recession because of oil prices dropping, they took a huge amount of bad debt from China. Now their entire economy is ruined and they cannot pay off those debts. Like this domino effect is something that ruins entire economies and the lives of the entirety of like people in many countries around the world, whereas government does not have proof, or at least not significant proof, way of the impact that diversification is going to happen. OG, if you're not
company
in 5 seconds.
If a country is entirely based on the drug market and cocaine, is it good to actually keep that market going, or is it better to tell them that this is a boom and bust market of a bad good so that they no longer continue being based on that and actually
I
save
think
the
there's a
process.
significant difference in between oil and drugs in that drugs have narco cartels and the drugs tend to kill people when you take them. I think you should have said that in your case if you wanted to run that. A POI is not enough. Finally, we want to talk about the climate, right? Because not at the point where it's cheaper to produce with oil or ship, as Przemek himself concedes in his speech, and also prices of gas fall globally, which means gas is more accessible to small entrepreneurships and people and stuff like this. This means it becomes cheaper to produce with oil, cheaper to use oil, to the extent to which new technology, R&D, shifting to a new sector, and the entry barriers to that sector are incredibly expensive anyway. This means that more oil is consumed and consumed in a more reckless way, especially because people want to utilize the opportunity of low prices before they rise again, or at least before they're expected to rise again. Which means that given that the climate is already fucked and we already are lacking the time to respond to the consequences to the climate, at this point, dropping prices of oil means a huge increase in pollution, in shipping, dirty waters, polluting rivers and stuff like this, which will incur more costs in the future for us to be able to repair, and is a far more important impact than OG saying we can ship more cheaply. We are the only team that has a reality check in this debate, so we should probably go through to this final.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech, and now I'd like to cross the floor and hear from the government whip speaker.
Can you guys hear me? Amazing. Just 1 second. Okay, perfect. In the second minute of his speech, oil has even caused wars in the past. In response to the POI, look, it's not like drugs, we have narco cartels. The fucking idea that oil hasn't caused violence and misery on this planet for the past century and a half is contradicted by the second minute of Tin's speech. The first thing I'm going to do is take out CO, then I'm going to take out O, then Veas against opening. What does closing opposition talk about? The first thing I want to say is that just because you talk about the world doesn't mean that your argument also doesn't scale in terms of improbability. It is harder to prove a global recession than it is to prove that the impacts that we're proving, which means that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Here are several reasons why the global recession might not happen. The first reason is sort of the thing that you said, that if you have investment in new sectors and the oil price is down right now, that's precisely what we said. There won't be an overnight shock where tomorrow you wake up and you're like, fuck, the price has hit zero, or you have no oil anymore. There will be a steady and sustained decline. That steady and sustained decline will happen precisely because of what Tin said, which is that new industries will still capitalize on that cheap oil. Consumers who can't switch to other industries will still capitalize on that cheap oil, which means that there will be limited consumption, which leads to a sustained decline, not something that you wake up tomorrow saying, oh no, what happened? Number two, I'm going to posit that the deindustrialization of Manchester as a city, or the de-agriculturalization of Pakistan in the 1960s, was a painful process. I think that's called moving on in the future. I just legitimately think that as the climate change argument becomes stronger and the evidence against it becomes stronger, in 40 years' time, they will not have the industries that Tin is talking about. I am glad that this push has occurred so that these industries can be ahead of the curve. This is very, very important to understand. Number three, you know who has the highest green energy R&D budget in the world? British fucking Petroleum. The reason for that is that they're already looking ahead. They're insuring against risks in the future because they have Harvard Business School schmucks sitting in there who tell you that you need to do this in case you don't get to do this in the future. How does Kira's session interact with this? Uniquely, the sector that you will move into will always be a sister industry. A sister industry because it's in the same sector, which has the same regulations, similar consumption patterns, similar export demand. For instance, the tobacco industry did not move into gold. It moved into the e-tobacco industry or the e-cigarette industry because it's a market that they know well. This is precisely what's going to happen in this case. Extremely unclear why a global recession happens. The second thing I want to say is this entire intuition of oil serves as a good indicator of market as a whole in the future. I'm just going to call bullshit on this because the only mechanism here was research has indicated, like I've tried to use this in the past, this doesn't work in. There are mechanisms why this isn't true. One, there are hundreds of commodities which exist that you can pin the same economy and market to, which will give you equally valuable indicators. I've heard gold is a good one. Number two, emerging markets and emerging markets and already developed markets. All of these markets interact with the oil price differently. For instance, a supply shock might help the UK, but might hurt China. So this entire intuition that just because oil price drops, everyone goes fucking crazy is just extremely untrue. I don't think that's how anything works. The last thing I want to note is a broad point about the characterization. Venezuela happened. Talked about this as well. Look, I am not going to defend incompetence. Venezuela knew this was going to happen for the past 2 fucking decades. Oil prices were going to drop at some point. The isolated example being the worst run government in the world is a testament to the fallacy of their case, because they were incompetent in not seeing the signs and transitioning. I think that's really, really important. Opening opposition. The first thing that I want to challenge here is the idea that states will be repressive. Look, you will not be repressive because a civil war might occur, because everyone's unhappy. Their response was interesting. Yeah, exactly. A civil war is pretty bad. No, you don't want a civil war to occur. You stop at step one. You stop at step one because you don't want to die in a sewer like Gaddafi did. You don't want to be ousted in embarrassment like Hosni Mubarak was. You want to get out as soon as possible or try to placate the people as much as possible. I think that's really important. Number two, internationally, there's more pressure now because historically the West has turned a blind eye to these conflicts and human rights abuses. It doesn't anymore because oil prices are dropping. There's less leverage to be had there. Oil is becoming less relevant in the geopolitics and geoeconomy of the world, which means that there's also international pressure to ensure that repression doesn't happen. That claim did not make sense. The second primary claim that they had was the idea that you will lose lots of money. I have like 4 things to say here. One, there's this fantastic thing. It's called borrowing. So you can borrow to ensure that you can guard yourself against short-term risks. Literally one mechanism that they had here. Poor credit rating. One, I'm going to trivially challenge this. I think the UAE and Qatar have some of the best credit ratings on the fucking planet. But number two, let's assume that they don't. They're like in the dumps or whatever. I think that there's this thing called subprime lending, which happens across the world. A lot of companies are going to look at the history of UAE and Qatar and say, yeah, these countries are going to bounce back and lend them a shit ton of money. Extremely unclear why that won't happen. Number two, you can short your own stocks. Like, I don't know why no one talked about this. Like OPEC countries know that oil prices will decline in the future. They can short their own stocks. They can sell them to make a profit later. Like, there's so many financial mechanisms that you can use because you have the most information about how your oil will do. Like, it's unclear why you won't have a first mover advantage in that financial market. Number three, creative destruction is a thing. Like, sometimes industries die down to allow certain new industries to pop up. Realistically, that's definitely going to happen for 2 reasons. One, the unique mechanisms Kira gave you. You invest in human potential now. The biggest impact of the resource course was missed by opening, which is a lack of incentive to invest in human capital. You are now forced to invest in human capital, the point at which your economy will die otherwise. You need schools because you can't just teach someone to work in an oil refinery anymore. You need healthcare because you can't plug oil revenues anymore. So you have to economize the cost of healthcare, etc., etc. But number two, I'll also say about creative destruction, some of these skills are transferable. Like, you working with machinery in an oil factory also translates into you working machinery in another industry. Like, a lot of these people who are employed within the oil sector can also move there. It's extremely unclear to me why they lose money. And the last point about not losing money, again, is the intuition that you can transition slowly. A steady decline is more likely to occur rather than overnight shock, which proves to you that O's claims are not valid. The last thing that I'll say is that the intuition behind both O and CO's case seems to be we're okay with dictatorships. Think about what their claim is. Because the claim seems to be, yeah, look, dictatorships are tough, but you've got to live tough, right? Because the global economy is at stake or the regional economy is at stake, depending on whether it's O or CO. I think that's fucking horrible morally, which is why Kira talked to you about the pain that these people live in and persist in every single day of their miserable existence. I think if anything, if these dictatorships are becoming slightly more democratic because you're empowering people through means of human capital development, that's a huge victory on our side, apart from, climate change and the existential risk of all of humanity dying. Why do we win it against opening? There are 3 reasons that we win against opening. The first is that we take opposition bench at their best and say that the oil price decline is persistent. And number 2, we don't use the motion at any point in time, the coronavirus of the 1970s. Our arguments apply to oil price declines generally. I think that's very, very important. Proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech, and now I'd like to cross the floor and hear from the opposition whip speaker. Thank you.
I have now done so many sanity checks and reread the motions so many times that I can label the government bench as nothing less but gaslighting. So I will give you just 2 points of general framing or logic, whatever you want to call them, and then I'm going to look at oil-dependent people in and outside democracies. I'm going to look at the global economy, and lastly, at climate change, and why, surprisingly, it falls on up, not on the side that gives out oil cheaply. Right. 1. The premise that underpins pretty much everything that both governments are saying is the idea that the low oil prices are something that is permanent rather than something that happens now. I understand that you would like that to be the case. However, they didn't give us any systematic reasons to think that now is the time when the boom and bust cycle of oil suddenly changes and the prices are constantly going to be low and are going to stay that way. And secondly, I don't think diversification is likely anyway. Let's walk through these 2 points, right? So, but before that, notice that this is not about whether oil is good or bad, right? Like, we don't have to defend that more people using more oil is good. I agree with you. I would like them to, I would like these countries to pivot away from it, and I would like no one to produce with oil because I care about the climate. But that's not going to happen just because we want it to happen, right? So let's look at the price drop. And I don't the problem is that despite the fact that it's a boom and bust cycles, the highs are high enough that you make enough profit that it makes up for the lows. And you use that profit or some of that profit to finance yourself through the lows because you know that the next time the price goes up is going to come and you want to still be in business and making money off it when that comes. Why are you unlikely to just, pour tons of resources into pivoting away? Because you've already invested ridiculous amounts of money in the capacities you have now, and retraining those people for clean energy isn't as easy as government seems to make it sound. But also, there are many systematic reasons to assume that the long-term demand for your oil is going to bounce back, and it's going to bounce back even when prices are higher. 1, because it's a finite resource, right? It's scarce, so it's almost necessarily eventually going to bounce back up. 2nd, because it's incredibly hard to shift away. Like, the reason why BP invests so much money already is because it takes decades and billions in order for you to even start a clean energy plant, right? 3rdly, it's very time consuming, but also 4thly, please notice that there are many other uses for oil other than energy. Like, plastics is literally the biggest industry in the world. It consumes some 40% of crude oil produced globally. That's not going to go away regardless of how much you invest in clean energy, right? But also, please notice that this whole idea of diversification, that doesn't happen when you're in a crisis and when you need loans for you to even stay afloat. You don't just get even more loans just to spend money on investment, right? Most investment that Dubai has made is because it had tons of money. BP made that investment, and when it was stable and making ridiculous amounts of profit, right? But also, OG's idea of you open up patents, why would you do that? It just allows you more competition, meaning it allows more supply of your resource when demand stays the same. So they would probably tank prices even lower. I don't understand your logic, OG. The idea of looking for alternative sources of energy is probably not going to happen when oil prices are low, right? And if it is going to happen, it is not going to happen because of low oil prices. It is going to happen because of other forces that are pushing for more clean energy. However, as long as governments are being bought by these corporations, I don't think there is going to be significant change anytime soon, right? Also, at a time at which oil prices are very low, it just makes sense for everyone who could produce with oil to do so, because they can cut their own costs, which means demand for oil goes up, which means it's a good time to be in business for oil. Also, on the idea of dictators who now want to keep the economy up will upskill their people, yes, it sounds great, but it's literally the least likely thing to happen in the world. 1, because it's dangerous if people have the power. If the whole reason why they want to stay, why they want to do things is to stay in power, then probably knowing that a civil war is likely to happen won't mean that they'll just put the power in the people's hands, right? Because upskilling would mean, 1, you can't keep people down as easily if they're educated. 2, it means you're dependent on your people because them striking kills your own country. And 3, it also takes a lot of resources and money that you lack at the moment, right? If anything, shuffling away from oil would probably look more like Bangladesh, and you do welcome NMCs, but for sweatshops, I don't think that is necessarily a win. But also, just the idea of they're scared of a civil war, so they won't suppress people. I mean, you should have given us any reasons for that, because Venezuela, Russia, and Iran are 3 examples of countries that did exactly that just in the 4 months that have passed in 2020. All 3 of them, I mean, especially Venezuela and Russia, but Iran was pretty bad as well, had massive repressions of their populations of the protests. None of them just decided to invest in clean energy. I don't know how you come to the idea that it's the likeliest thing for them to do. But also Tin tells you about the bad debt and the domino effect, because you need instant relief. And that is unresponded to beyond, it makes sense to lend them tons of money because they'll rebound. Well, if you're correct and oil prices will never rebound, then it wouldn't make sense to lend to them. So that means necessarily eventually they will make profit of oil again. But also the idea of shorting your own stocks, why would you make a public statement that you are convinced your own stocks will tank for you to make a bit of profit out of it? That makes absolutely no sense. Okay, so the idea of the global economic crisis, I think most of the things that Tin give you are largely unresponded, but also just beyond saying, it's just an intuition and it's untrue. But oil is the most traded commodity in the world at the moment. There is no commodity tied to as many sectors as oil is. You're way out of time. Military, shipping, gas, automobiles are things that just can't pivot away from oil immediately, which means whether we think oil is important or not, there are a lot of industries that respond very sharply to what happens on the oil market. Lastly, on the idea of climate change, I just think it's very intuitive that if you have the choice between investing in clean energy and buying clean energy that is still quite highly priced, even in times when oil prices are relatively stable and much higher than they are now, it's still more expensive to use clean energy. Now it gets even more unlikely that you'll choose clean energy over oil when oil prices are very low, which means that consumption of oil is probably going to go up, and which means that demand for sustainable energy looks even lower than usual, meaning it gets even more of a bad idea for you to start investing in renewable energies. I don't think anyone wins when oil prices are low. That is not the way to get rid of oil globally. I'm very proud to oppose.
Can you hear me? Yeah, cool. I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech, and indeed you all for a fantastic debate. Could you exit the breakout room? Please don't return, and we'll be out at some stage.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.